the Hinterkaifeck Murders. Germany, in the early 1920s, was a nation teetering on the brink of collapse. The war, the Treaty of Versailles, and the ensuing economic nightmare had left the country broken, both physically and psychologically. The streets of Berlin, Munich, and other once proud cities were filled with whispers of betrayal and fear, as the Weimar government struggled to maintain control over a populace that had lost all faith in its ability to lead. The aftermath of World War I loomed large over the entire nation, and nowhere was the devastation more palpable than in the lives of ordinary Germans. It all started in the ashes of the Great War. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, had been a humiliating blow to Germany. It wasn't just the loss of land, which was a staggering 13% of its territory, including valuable coal-rich areas like the Saar Basin, but also the crippling reparations that the country was forced to pay to the victorious powers, France and Great Britain. The total was mind-boggling. 132 billion gold marks, a sum that would drain Germany of its wealth for generations to come. The treaty left Germany with a sense of national humiliation and hopelessness, setting the stage for political unrest and social turmoil. "Look at what they've done to us," Hans murmured bitterly to his fellow workers in a factory in Berlin, his voice barely audible over the grinding noise of machines. "First, they tear apart our land. Then they demand we pay for the destruction. How are we supposed to survive this?" His friend, Karl, paused in his work, wiping his brow. "We won't. Not unless we do something about it. The government can't even hold onto a single mark." His hands were shaking as he spoke, a side effect of the growing sense of instability around them. They knew the truth. They had been abandoned. The Weimar Republic, established after the war, was supposed to rebuild the nation, but all it had done was plunge it into deeper despair. The government, in an attempt to keep up with the demands of the war reparations, resorted to printing more and more money. But this only made things worse. The inflation rate began to spiral out of control. By 1922, prices were climbing at an unsustainable pace. A loaf of bread, which had cost only a few pennies a year earlier, now cost millions of marks. The average German worker, whose wages were not nearly keeping up with the rising prices, found themselves unable to afford even the most basic necessities. In the bustling city of Munich, a young woman named Eva stood in line at a bakery, her hands clutching a small stack of banknotes. She glanced nervously at the signboard above the counter, where the price of a loaf of bread had just been increased again. She turned to the woman behind her in line, an elderly woman with a thin face and clothes that had seen better days. "How much do you think this will cost tomorrow?" Eva asked, her voice tinged with anxiety. The old woman gave a wry smile. "Tomorrow? Who knows? The way things are going, we'll be using this money to light our stoves. It's the only thing it's good for anymore." Eva nodded solemnly, her eyes falling to the banknotes in her hand. She knew she wasn't the only one who had begun burning money just to keep warm. Everywhere she went, she saw people doing the same, tossing the worthless paper into stoves, watching as it crackled and turned to ash. It was a perverse irony. The very money that had once been the symbol of Germany's power now served only as fuel for the fire. In desperation, people tried to exchange their paper notes for anything tangible, precious metals, food, or goods. But even those were in short supply. Meanwhile, the streets of Berlin had become battlegrounds for political factions. With the Weimar government weak and increasingly unpopular, extremist groups on both the far left and far right grew more vocal and violent. In 1921, the German Workers' Party, later to become the Nazi Party, began to gain traction. Led by the charismatic and dangerous Adolf Hitler, it promised to restore Germany's honor and undo the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles. But it also stirred hatred, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism, setting the stage for future horrors. But it wasn't just the far right that posed a threat. Left-wing radicals, bolstered by the failed Spartacist uprising earlier in the decade, continued to push for a communist revolution. In the streets, there were constant clashes between the two factions, with violence erupting on a near-daily basis. It seemed as though there was no peace to be had, only chaos and bloodshed. "The government can't protect us anymore," said Max, a man who had been watching the news unfold from his small shop in the heart of Munich. "We'll have to fend for ourselves soon. Look at what's happening in the streets. Every day, there's a new fight, a new bloodbath." His customer, a middle-aged woman, nodded in agreement. "I don't know what's worse, the violence or the hunger. At least with the fighting, you can feel something, you can react. But hunger, that breaks a person down from the inside." The mood was darkening across Germany, and even the countryside, far removed from the capital's political strife, was not untouched by the unrest. In the rural Bavarian village of Kaifeck, life carried on as it always had, until one fateful night when a brutal crime would take place, shattering the tranquility of the countryside forever. The Hinterkaifeck Murders, where an entire family and their maid were slaughtered in cold blood, would become one of the most famous unsolved crimes in German history. What made the crime even more perplexing was the state of the country at the time. Amid the economic ruin and political violence, the killer's identity remained a mystery, and the case would eventually fade from public attention, leaving only a haunting question in its wake. What drove someone to commit such a horrific act in the midst of a country already teetering on the edge of ruin? Germany's struggles in the early 1920s created the perfect storm for societal collapse. The economic collapse, political chaos, and growing unrest all set the stage for unspeakable horrors that would forever mark the country's history. Amid this chaos, the Hinterkaifeck Murders stood as a grim reminder of the fragility of human life and the dark undercurrents that can bubble to the surface in times of crisis. The Hinterkaifeck farm stood in quiet isolation, nestled in the Bavarian countryside, its fields stretching endlessly under the pale spring sky. The villagers of Kaifeck, a small, close-knit community about 40 miles from Munich, had long known the Smith family, Andrew, the aging but stubborn patriarch, his wife Cecilia, known for her strict ways, their widowed daughter Victoria, a woman whose past held secrets, and Victoria's 2 children, little Cecilia and baby Joseph. Despite their reclusive nature, they were a family that the village respected, if not entirely understood. It wasn't until April 4th, 1922, that the farm's silence became unbearable. That morning, a group of concerned villagers gathered at the entrance to the property. They had noticed something unusual. No smoke rising from the chimney, no sign of movement. The family had not been seen in days. With uneasy glances at one another, a local farmer named Carl stepped forward. "I don't like this," he muttered, gripping the wooden latch of the barn door. The others nodded in agreement. The heavy door creaked as Carl pushed it open, revealing a horrifying sight. "Oh, dear God!" One of the men staggered backward, pressing a hand over his mouth. There, in the dim light of the barn, lay the bodies of Andrew, Cecilia, Victoria, and young Cecilia. Their faces were barely recognizable, caked in dried blood and dirt, their heads crushed by some brutal force. Straw had been hastily thrown over them as if the killer had wanted to conceal the horror, but had lost interest halfway through. Shaken, the group hurried into the house, their boots echoing ominously against the wooden floor. The air inside was still, thick with a staleness that clung to the walls. In one of the small bedrooms, they found Maria Gardner, the maid who had only arrived the day before, slumped lifelessly on her bed, her skull caved in. In the nursery, the final discovery sent chills down their spines. 2-year-old Joseph lay motionless in his crib, his tiny body robbed of life just as mercilessly as the others. A thick silence settled over the house. Then Carl whispered, "Who could do something like this?" No one had an answer. The authorities arrived later that day, making their way through the grim scene with expressions of disbelief and horror. Chief Inspector George Raingruber stood at the edge of the barn, his gloved hands clenched tightly behind his back. "The murders happened days ago," he murmured to his assistant. "But someone's been here since." The evidence was chilling. The farm animals had been fed. The cows had been milked. The family's dog had been let out and back in. Someone had lived in the house after the massacre, tending to the daily chores as though nothing had happened. Inside the house, an officer called out, "Sir, you'll want to see this." In the attic, they found signs of an intruder, hay that had been used as bedding, footprints in the dust, and remnants of food. It was as if someone had been watching the family from above before striking. Whispers spread through the village like wildfire. "Who could have done it?" an old woman murmured at the marketplace. "Maybe a drifter," suggested a young man. "No," a farmer shook his head gravely. "Someone knew them. Someone was close enough to stay in that house, eat their food, sleep under their roof after what they had done." Suspicion grew, but no clear answers emerged. As the investigation unfolded, dark rumors about the Smith family surfaced. Some spoke of Andrew's cruelty, his strict hand that ruled over the household. Others whispered about Victoria's past, how she had been widowed young, how her relationship with her father was unnatural. And there was the matter of little Joseph, the boy, a villager murmured over a pint at the local tavern. There was talk he wasn't Victoria's late husband's son at all. Then whose was he? A pause. A glance. And then the whisper, barely audible, Andrew's. If it were true, it meant that the Smith family had lived with a terrible secret, one that could have driven someone to a murderous rage. But was it enough to explain the brutality of the crime? Weeks passed, then months, then years. Suspects were questioned, theories were debated, but the killer was never found. Some believed it was a robbery gone horribly wrong, yet no valuables had been taken. Others thought it was a crime of passion, a vendetta. And some, the most fearful, spoke in hushed voices of something far more sinister, of spirits, of demons, of something lurking in the night, waiting for the right moment to strike. Even as time wore on, Hinterkaifeck never escaped the weight of its past. Travelers who passed by the ruins of the farmstead spoke of an eerie feeling, a presence that lingered. Some said they heard whispers in the wind, the faint cry of a child. Others swore they saw shadows moving between the trees, always watching, always waiting. And so, the tragedy of Hinterkaifeck remained, an unsolved nightmare frozen in time, a question forever unanswered. The village of Kaifeck had always been a quiet place, where people knew their neighbors by name and seldom locked their doors at night. But in the first days of April 1922, an unsettling silence hung over the Hinterkaifeck farm. The Smith family had not been seen in town for several days, not at church, not at the market, not anywhere. Johann Meyer, a farmer who lived nearby, was the first to grow suspicious. He had stopped by the farm earlier that week to borrow tools from Andrew Smith, but no one had answered the door. That in itself was strange. Andrew was a man of habit, always tending to his land. And yet the livestock had been fed, and smoke had risen from the chimney just a day prior. On April 4th, Johann had had enough. He gathered two other neighbors, Karl Wagner and Peter Hoffman, and the three of them set out for the farm. The gate creaked loudly as they pushed it open, the wooden beams groaning under their weight. Karl called out, "Andrew, Victoria, anyone home?" Silence. Peter stepped forward, knocking hard on the front door. When no one answered, a nervous glance passed between them. Johann hesitated before stepping toward the barn. "Maybe they're working inside," he suggested, gripping the handle. As he pushed the heavy door open, the stench of dried blood filled his nostrils. A sudden wave of nausea hit him, but it was nothing compared to what lay before them. "Dear God," Peter whispered, staggering backward. For bodies lay in a tangled heap on the dirt floor, half covered with straw. Andrew, Cecilia, Victoria, and young Cecilia had been brutally beaten, their skulls shattered with what looked like a farming tool, perhaps a mattock. The injuries were so severe that their faces were barely recognizable. Johann's breathing turned shallow. Who could do something like this? Carl stumbled away, pressing a hand to his mouth. We need the police. The men rushed back to the village, their voices panicked as they gathered the authorities. Within hours, officers from Munich arrived, their expressions grim as they took in the horror before them. But the nightmare wasn't over. An officer, peering through the farmhouse window, noticed something strange. The beds inside looked disturbed, one as if someone had been lying in it recently. Summoning his courage, he stepped inside. The first bedroom held no answers, only a neatly made bed and the faint smell of wood smoke. But the second, "My God," he muttered, his stomach twisting. Maria Gardner, the maid who had only started working at Hinterkaifeck a day before the murders, lay dead in her bed. Her skull had been caved in by the same brutal force. The officer swallowed hard and turned toward the nursery. His hands trembled as he pushed the door open. A crib stood in the corner, its wooden frame slightly rocking from the draft. Inside, little Joseph lay still, too still. Another officer approached from behind. "Is he?" The first man gave a slow, pained nod. The toddler had been killed in his sleep, just as brutally as the others. A thick silence filled the house as the weight of the crime settled upon them. By nightfall, the bodies had been carefully removed, and an autopsy began. What the doctors found chilled even the most hardened investigators. "These weren't just murders," said Dr. Bernard Lang, removing his bloodstained gloves. "They were executions." The victims had suffered severe blunt force trauma, their skulls fractured repeatedly. Andrew had deep gashes along his arms, suggesting he had fought back. Cecilia, despite her old age, had signs of strangulation, in addition to her head wounds. But the most horrifying revelation was young Cecilia. She had not died instantly. "There's evidence," Dr. Lang murmured, "that she was alive for hours after the attack. She was found gripping tufts of her own hair. She tore it out in agony before succumbing." The room fell silent. No one spoke of the images burned into their minds. Piecing together the timeline, the investigators determined the crime had occurred on March 31st. But how had no one heard anything? The farm wasn't too far from the village. Surely, someone should have noticed screams, a struggle, something. A chilling thought surfaced. The killer had likely remained at the farm for days after the murders. Someone had continued feeding the animals, milking the cows. Someone had been inside that house, lying in those beds, eating that food, all while 6 corpses lay rotting just a few feet away. Speculation ran rampant. Maybe it was a robbery, one officer suggested. But nothing of value had been taken. Money had been found untouched in the house. Could it have been a drifter? Someone passing through? If so, why had they stayed after the killings? Dark rumors began to spread among the villagers. Andrew had enemies, an old woman whispered to a friend at the marketplace. He was a hard man, always keeping secrets. And Victoria, another woman, added cautiously. There were rumors about her and her father. The weight of the unsaid words lingered in the air. Others spoke of supernatural forces. Hinterkaifeck had always been an eerie place, some said. The previous maid had quit months earlier, claiming the farm was haunted. She had heard footsteps in the attic at night, whispers through the walls. Andrew had dismissed her fears, but now, had the killer been watching from the attic all along? Days turned to weeks, and the investigation continued, but no clear suspect emerged. The case remained a mystery, filling the village with unease. Eventually, the farm was abandoned, left to decay under the Bavarian sky. Over the years, travelers passing through claimed they felt something there, an oppressive silence, an unseen presence. Some swore they heard footsteps in the ruins, whispers in the wind. And the question remained, who had murdered the Smith family and why? The days leading up to the murders at Hinterkaifeck were filled with an unease that settled over the farm like a thick fog, an unease that Andrew Smith, a man not easily shaken, could not ignore. It had started with the footprints. On a cold morning in early March, Andrew stepped outside to inspect his land. The winter frost was beginning to fade, leaving the earth damp and soft beneath his boots. As he approached the barn, he noticed something strange, footprints in the mud, leading from the dense forest at the edge of his property straight to his house. He frowned. The deep imprints suggested a heavy-set man. But what disturbed him more was the fact that the tracks simply ended at the farmhouse door. There were no footprints leading away. Andrew's grip tightened around the handle of the axe he carried. He turned sharply, scanning the surrounding fields, the barn, the chicken coop. Nothing. Everything was as it should be. But that sense of unease clung to him. That night, as the wind howled through the trees, he sat at the wooden kitchen table, deep in thought. His wife, Cecilia, bustled about, setting out bowls for supper. "You're quiet tonight," she observed, glancing at him. Andrew hesitated before speaking. "I saw something strange today. Footprints. Leading to the house." Victoria, their daughter, who had been helping little Cecilia with her supper, looked up. "And? No prints leaving," Andrew muttered. Cecilia let out a sharp breath. "You think someone's been sneaking around?" Andrew shook his head. "I don't know, but I don't like it." That night, he locked the doors carefully, something he rarely did in the safety of their isolated farm. But even that did little to ease his nerves. Then came the noises. It started as faint rustling sounds, barely noticeable at first. A soft creak of wood, the whisper of something shifting in the attic. The kind of sounds an old house makes when the wind pushes against it. But soon it became more distinct. One evening, as the family sat by the fireplace, there was a sudden thump above them. Everyone fell silent. Andrew narrowed his eyes and stood, grabbing a lantern and heading for the attic ladder. "Be careful," Papa Victoria warned. He climbed the rickety wooden steps, the lantern's flickering light casting long shadows on the walls. The attic was cluttered with old trunks, broken furniture, and sacks of grain. Dust hung thick in the air. Andrew stepped forward cautiously, his breath visible in the cold space. Nothing. But just as he was about to turn back, he noticed something, a small indentation in the straw piled in the corner, as if someone had been lying there. A chill ran down his spine. The next morning, Andrew searched the property, checking the locks on the doors and windows. That was when he realized something else. His keys were missing. "Are you sure you didn't misplace them?" Cecilia asked. "I never misplace anything," Andrew snapped, his frustration mounting. That same day, an old crumpled newspaper appeared on their kitchen table, one that no one in the family recognized. "This isn't ours," Victoria murmured, flipping through the pages. The print was from a town miles away, a place none of them had recently visited. Andrew took the paper from her and stared at it, deep in thought. If the footprints, the noises, and the missing keys hadn't unsettled him before, this did. Then, as if sensing something was terribly wrong, their maid packed her belongings and left. "I won't stay here another night," she told Cecilia firmly. "Why?" Cecilia demanded. The maid hesitated before whispering. "There's something in this house. I hear things. I feel things. I see shadows moving where there shouldn't be any. You should leave, too." Cecilia scoffed, but the words stayed with her. The Smiths needed help on the farm, so they quickly found a replacement, Maria Gardner, a young woman in need of work. She arrived on the morning of March 31st, carrying only a small suitcase. Victoria greeted her warmly. "Welcome to Hinterkaifeck. I hope you'll feel at home here." Maria smiled politely, though she sensed an odd tension in the air. The family looked tired, their eyes shadowed. There was a heaviness in the house, something unspoken. That night, Maria lay awake in her new bed, listening. The farmhouse was still. But then, a creak, a soft rustling. the faintest whisper of movement above her head. She squeezed her eyes shut. It's just an old house, she told herself. Just settling noises. But as she drifted into uneasy sleep, she had no idea that before sunrise she and everyone in the house would be dead. The next morning, Hinterkaifeck was silent once more. The cows lowed in their stalls, unfed. The chickens wandered the yard aimlessly. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney. And somewhere, in the dark corners of that empty house, the presence that had haunted the Smith family for weeks remained. The investigation into the Hinterkaifeck murders was unlike anything the Bavarian police had ever encountered. The brutality of the crime, the eerie circumstances leading up to it, and the complete lack of any clear motive left both the authorities and the villagers in a state of uneasy confusion. On the morning of April 5, 1922, the Munich police arrived at the farm. The crime scene had already been disturbed. Neighbors, in their shock and curiosity, had trampled through the barn and house before law enforcement could secure it. Still, the lead investigator, Chief Inspector George Reingruber, was determined to find answers. Standing over the bloodstained straw in the barn, Reingruber muttered, "This was no robbery." Sergeant Klaus Bauer, one of his assistants, nodded. "Nothing's missing. Money was found untouched inside the house." Reingruber crouched beside the bodies, his gloved hand hovering over Andrew Smith's lifeless form. The patriarch's skull had been crushed with repeated blows, just like the others. The sheer force suggested not just a desire to kill, but an overwhelming rage. Bauer hesitated. "Sir, this level of brutality, this was personal?" Reingruber exhaled sharply. "Then we start with the people closest to the victims." Over the next several weeks, the police interrogated over 100 local men. Farmers, laborers, merchants, anyone who had even the faintest connection to the Smith family was brought in for questioning. One by one, they sat across from Reingruber in the small police station in Kaifeck. "Where were you on the night of March 31st? Did you have any disputes with Andrew Smith? Had you ever visited the farm?" Most of the men were forthcoming. Some spoke of Andrew's harsh nature, his tight grip over his family. Others whispered about the strange rumors that had surrounded Victoria and her father. But not one of them could provide solid evidence, and not a single arrest was made. The case was going cold, and frustration grew. Reingruber slammed his fist on his desk late one night. "We're missing something, Bauer. Someone out there knows more than they're saying." Bauer hesitated before speaking. "Sir, there's something else." Reingruber looked up. "What?" "The villagers, some of them, are saying the farm was cursed. That spirits haunted the Smiths before the murders." Reingruber scoffed, rubbing his temples. "I need facts, not ghost stories." But as the weeks passed, with no new leads, desperation set in. Out of options, the authorities made an unusual decision. They consulted a clairvoyant. In a gruesome attempt to gain insight into the murders, the victims' skulls were removed and sent to a well-known psychic in Munich. The clairvoyant examined them, running her fingers over the fractures, her face contorted in deep concentration. Hours later, she looked up at the officers watching her. "The killer was someone close," she said cryptically. But when pressed for details, "Who? Why?" she only shook her head. "The spirits are silent." The skulls were never returned to the family. Some say they were lost in the chaos of World War II. Others believe they were deliberately hidden, as if the dead themselves refused to speak their secrets. With traditional investigative methods failing, whispers of an impossible theory began circulating in the village. What if Carl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, had committed the murders? Carl had been declared dead during World War I, but his body had never been recovered. Some villagers speculated that he had faked his death and returned, filled with rage over rumors of Victoria's affair with her own father. Could he have come back for revenge? Reingruber personally led the investigation into this theory, tracking down Carl's former comrades from the war. One by one, they confirmed the same story. Carl had died on the battlefield. They had seen his body. The theory collapsed, leaving the investigation at another dead end. By the summer of 1922, the case had completely stalled. The lack of arrests and the eerie nature of the crime left the villagers in a state of paranoia. People locked their doors at night, something unheard of in the countryside. Strangers were eyed with suspicion. Children were warned never to wander near the ruins of Hinterkaifeck. Some claimed they could still hear the cries of young Cecilia in the wind, her spirit trapped in the place where she had suffered in agony before her death. Others swore they saw flickering lights in the abandoned farmhouse, as if the killer had returned to visit the scene of his crime. Years passed. The farm was eventually demolished, erasing its presence from the landscape. But the mystery of Hinterkaifeck refused to fade. Even decades later, people continued to speculate. Was it a family member? A drifter? A vengeful spirit? No one ever found out. And perhaps no one ever will. The investigation into the murders at Hinterkaifeck had already sent shockwaves through the community. But as the police delved deeper into the Smith family's past, they uncovered a web of secrets that seemed to grow darker with every thread pulled. It began with Victoria, the Smith family's daughter, whose relationship with her father, Andrew, had always been known to be tense. In fact, for years, there had been murmurs, whispers in the village about the nature of their bond. One evening, shortly after the murders were discovered, Inspector Rain Gruber sat across from an elderly villager in the dimly lit corner of the local tavern. The old man, Wilhelm, had known the Smiths for decades. His face, weathered and lined with years of hard labor, looked even more grim as he lowered his voice. "I don't know if anyone's told you yet, Inspector," Wilhelm said, glancing around the room to ensure no one else was listening. "But Victoria and her father, Andrew, well, there were rumors." Rain Gruber raised an eyebrow. "Rumors? What kind of rumors?" "The kind that shouldn't be spoken about out loud," Wilhelm continued. "But people knew. There was talk that Andrew had, more than a father's love for Victoria." He paused, looking at Rain Gruber with a solemn expression. "Some said it wasn't just a poor relationship, it was something worse. Incest." Rain Gruber's pulse quickened. He leaned forward. "What are you saying?" Wilhelm lowered his voice even further, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "There were accusations years ago, no proof, mind you, but enough people said they saw things. They said Victoria was different after certain visits from her father." He sighed, shaking his head. Of course, Andrew denied everything, and nothing was ever proven. He was acquitted, you know. Rain Gruber's thoughts raced as the old man's words settled in his mind. The possibility that such a dark, hidden secret had festered inside the Smith family was enough to raise suspicions about what had truly been happening behind closed doors. Could this strained, unhealthy dynamic have led to something more violent? Was it possible that the murders were motivated by the same dark forces that had plagued the Smith family for years? But there was one problem. Andrew, the man at the center of the allegations, had been murdered along with the rest of his family. So, while the rumors about the relationship between father and daughter painted a disturbing picture, they didn't provide any answers, only more questions. Then another theory began to emerge, a theory that centered around young Joseph, the innocent 2-year-old whose life had been cruelly extinguished along with his family's. Some in the village began to whisper that Andrew wasn't Joseph's father after all. "It wasn't him," one of Victoria's old friends said, lowering her voice as she spoke with Rain Gruber. "Joseph wasn't Andrew's son. It was Lawrence Cooper's boy." "Lawrence Cooper?" Rain Gruber frowned, unfamiliar with the name. "Lawrence was Victoria's suitor," the woman explained. "A young man from the next village over. He and Victoria were very close, perhaps even more than that. People suspected they had more than just a flirtation going on." She looked around nervously, making sure no one could overhear. "And Joseph, well, he looked a lot more like Lawrence than he did Andrew." Rain Gruber thought for a moment. The theory seemed plausible. If Lawrence was Joseph's biological father, then perhaps there was a motive for him to be involved in the murders. If Victoria had kept this a secret, if she had hidden Joseph's true paternity, maybe Andrew had found out and had threatened to expose her. But the more Rain Gruber dug, the more the theory seemed less and less likely. Lawrence Cooper, after all, had no apparent motive to murder 6 people. He was a quiet, hard-working man with no history of violence. He had no connections to any criminal activity. And most importantly, there was no evidence linking him to the murders. The villagers, though, were convinced that something sinister had happened between Victoria and Lawrence. They whispered that Victoria's involvement with Lawrence had been the root of the conflict, not only with her father, but also within herself. The rumors of an illicit affair, of a forbidden love, if that was true, would have cast a shadow over everything that had come before. But as Rain Gruber continued his investigation, the trail of suspicion kept leading to dead ends. One evening, as the inspector sat by the dying embers of a fire in the local tavern, his thoughts began to swirl. He had interviewed every possible suspect, checked every lead, and yet the answers remained elusive. The family's deep-rooted secrets had only complicated things further. He ran a hand through his hair and muttered to himself, what happened at Hinterkaifeck wasn't just about a maniac or a random killer. No, this was personal. This was family. Rain Gruber's thoughts were interrupted when Bauer entered the tavern, looking weary from yet another day of fruitless searching. "There's something I don't understand," Bauer said, sitting across from the inspector. "Why kill the entire family? Why 6 people? Rain Gruber shook his head. "That's the part that doesn't make sense. If it was just about Joseph, if it was about keeping a secret, why take out the entire family?" He stared into the flames, lost in thought. The theories about Victoria and Lawrence, about Andrew's alleged incest, were troubling, but they didn't add up to a complete explanation. Something about this murder, this family, gnawed at him. "There's something darker at play here," Rain Gruber muttered. "But I don't know what it is." As the days stretched on and no new leads surfaced, the investigation remained at a standstill. The Smith family's secrets, rumors of incest, forbidden love, and family betrayal had only clouded the truth, creating a labyrinth of suspicion with no clear way out. Despite their efforts, no one could explain why 6 lives had been violently ended. And with each passing day, the mystery grew deeper, darker, and more unsettling. As the investigation into the Hinterkaifeck murders deepened, the police found themselves confronting more questions than answers. At first, it seemed like the obvious answer, robbery. After all, a family living in isolation, with no apparent witnesses, seemed like an easy target for a thief looking to make off with valuables. However, the discovery of the crime scene turned everything upside down. One by one, the investigators combed through the Smith family's farmhouse. The house was unremarkable, simple, functional, with a few personal mementos that spoke to the Smiths' modest life. There was nothing particularly extravagant or valuable. But one detail stood out that immediately cast doubt on the robbery theory. A large sum of money, hundreds of marks, was found untouched in the house. It was clear that whoever had committed the murders had not been after the family's wealth. The lead investigator, Inspector Rain Gruber, stood frozen in the middle of the living room as he examined the scattered bills on the table. "It doesn't make sense, Bauer. Why kill 6 people if you're not after anything?" Sergeant Bauer scratched his chin, staring down at the money. Maybe the killer didn't care about money. But why take so much time to do this? He gestured vaguely to the room, the bloody traces leading to every corner. "It's almost like they weren't in a rush." Rain Gruber frowned. "It's not just about the money, though. There's something else here, something deeper." The more they investigated, the more bizarre details emerged, each one stranger than the last. It was as if the killer or killers had lingered on the farm after the murders. The livestock had been tended to, the fireplace had been used, and even food from the Smiths' own kitchen had been consumed. The police found traces of cooked food on the stove. Someone had been eating there, sitting by the fire as if they were completely at ease. They even discovered that the killer had used some of the family's bedding to sleep in the barn after the brutal killings. It was as if the crime had been committed by someone who was familiar with the family's routine, someone who knew the layout of the property as if they had lived there before. "We've got something strange here," Bauer said one evening as he reviewed the notes. "This wasn't a robbery, and it wasn't some random act of violence. Whoever did this, they were comfortable. Like they knew the place." Rain Gruber nodded gravely. He had been thinking the same thing. A stranger wouldn't have stayed. A stranger wouldn't have tended to the animals or used the fireplace. But why would they stay? Bauer asked, his brow furrowing. "After what they did." "Exactly," Rain Gruber said, his voice low. "This isn't just about the murders. It's about something more, something that hasn't been uncovered yet." In the days that followed, the investigators continued to explore every possible lead. They spoke with neighbors, questioned those who had visited the farm recently, and even looked into the possibility of an outside killer who had entered the property with the intent to kill and left behind these strange marks of familiarity. But the more they learned, the more elusive the truth became. One of the theories that began to take hold was that the killer had been someone who was very close to the Smiths. Perhaps it wasn't just a crime of passion, it was something far more calculated. Someone who knew the family's habits, their routines, the way they lived. But even this theory didn't explain the unsettling aftereffects of the crime. The killer had stayed at the farm, acting as though nothing had happened, as though they were right at home. The village was gripped by fear, with every man, woman, and child wondering whether the killer was still among them. Could the killer still be walking around Kaifeck, blending in unnoticed? The idea that someone familiar with the Smith family's life could have done this was chilling. People began to eye each other with suspicion. Was it the gruff farmer down the road? The quiet blacksmith? No one knew. As the weeks dragged on, the police found themselves stymied. Even the most plausible suspects were ruled out. Victoria's suitor, Lawrence Cooper, had an alibi. The former maid, who had quit just days before the murders, was long gone, and no evidence pointed to her. The theory that the killer was someone from the family fell apart as Andrew, the one most closely tied to the rumors of incest, was himself a victim. Rain Gruber sat at his desk late one night, his head resting in his hands. He had seen many grisly cases in his career, but nothing like this. Nothing that seemed to defy reason. "Maybe we're looking at this all wrong," Bauer mused, sitting across from him. "Maybe it wasn't about killing for gain, but killing for something else." "What do you mean?" Rain Gruber asked without looking up. "Maybe it wasn't about what they took, but about what they wanted to leave behind," Bauer continued. "The killer didn't need money. He didn't need any of the things the family had. Maybe what he wanted was control, to destroy what they had, and leave it all in ruins." Rain Gruber straightened, a new thought dawning on him. A message. This wasn't about greed, it was about domination, about making the family feel powerless, about breaking them down, destroying their very existence. But that thought brought more questions than answers. Who would have wanted to destroy the Smiths so thoroughly? Why stay after the murders? Why feed the animals, sleep in the barn, and consume the family's food, all while leaving the crime scene intact? The investigation continued, but as the months passed, the killer seemed to vanish, without a trace. The farm, once a home, was abandoned, and the crime itself became a mystery locked in time, one that would never truly be solved. The lack of financial theft, the strange presence of the killer on the farm, and the eerie calmness of the crime all pointed to something much darker than anyone had anticipated. The village of Kaifeck would never be the same again. Fear lingered in the air like a heavy fog, and the legacy of the Hinterkaifeck murders would haunt the community for generations to come. The killer, it seemed, was gone, but the questions remained, unanswered and unresolved. In the early months of 1923, the village of Kaifeck was finally starting to recover from the shock of the brutal murders at Hinterkaifeck. The community, forever scarred by the tragedy, tried to return to normalcy, but a haunting memory lingered in the air. The farmstead, once the scene of unimaginable horror, had become an eerie reminder of the violence that had ripped apart the Smith family and their maid. The land itself seemed to hold the memories of those lost lives, and for some, it was too much to bear. By the spring of that year, the authorities made a decision that would alter the landscape forever. The farmstead, with its dark history, was to be demolished. There were whispers among the villagers that it was to be destroyed to prevent it from becoming a macabre tourist attraction, an unsettling curiosity for those drawn to the sinister events that had unfolded there. The demolition began quietly, with little fanfare. Workers moved onto the property, their faces drawn and tense. The atmosphere around the farm was thick with dread. Some of the laborers were local men, and they had heard the rumors of what had happened behind the farmhouse walls. They knew the place was cursed, even if they didn't fully understand why. As the men began tearing down the buildings, a chilling discovery was made. The foundation of the barn, where the bodies of Andrew, Cecilia, Victoria, and little Cecilia had been found, was being carefully excavated when one of the workers, Heinrich, suddenly froze. He dropped his shovel with a loud clang, his face pale, his body trembling. "What's wrong?" called out a fellow worker, his voice thick with the weariness of the long day. Heinrich pointed to something buried beneath the dirt. There, half hidden in the earth, lay a familiar, blood-stained object, the very mattock that had been used to kill the Smith family. The workers stared in stunned silence, unsure of how to react to the gruesome weapon being unearthed before their eyes. The mattock, still stained with the remnants of blood, seemed to hold a sinister power over the workers. Some of them recoiled in fear, others muttered prayers, and some even suggested that the weapon had been hidden there by the killer themselves, perhaps to mock the authorities, or perhaps to ensure that no one would ever find it. Heinrich couldn't look away. "It's the tool," he muttered under his breath. "It's the one used in the murders." His voice was hoarse, like he was trying to convince himself that it couldn't be real. The discovery of the murder weapon stirred up old fears, and soon the news of it spread like wildfire through the village. But the authorities were quick to intervene. The police arrived, cordoning off the area, and a thorough investigation began. Forensic experts examined the weapon, confirming its connection to the murders. It was a piece of tangible evidence that tied the killer directly to the horrific crime. However, the discovery did little to bring peace to the haunted village. Despite the chilling reminder, the decision to demolish the farmstead went ahead. The house, the barn, and the outbuildings were reduced to rubble, and the land was cleared. The site, once a family home, was now nothing but an empty lot, its dark history buried beneath the earth. The bodies of the victims were exhumed and buried properly in the local cemetery, but their skulls remained in the hands of authorities for further investigation, a grim reminder of the unsolved mystery. As time passed, the case began to fade from public memory. Germany was swept into the maelstrom of larger geopolitical crises. The roaring fires of World War I had barely died down before the storm clouds of another war began to gather. The horrors of war, the rising tensions in Europe, and the shifting political landscape dominated the national consciousness. The people of Kaifeck, like the rest of the world, were consumed by the vast changes sweeping across the globe. For a time, the murders at Hinterkaifeck were relegated to the past, a distant tragedy in the shadow of war. Yet, the story of Hinterkaifeck never truly disappeared. It lingered, like an unsolved riddle, buried beneath the surface of the community's collective memory. The townspeople went about their lives, but there was always the sense that the land held a darker secret, something that would never fully be understood. Though the case faded from public discourse, it left a lasting mark on the village. The farmhouse, demolished and gone, was now just a spot on the map, but the residents of Kaifeck couldn't forget what had happened there. Old-timers would still speak of it, quietly, in hushed tones, to those who didn't know the story. There were rumors that the land was cursed, that the spirits of the victims still haunted the property, and that their restless souls would never be at peace. The land, they said, had absorbed the terror, the bloodshed, and the fear, and it would carry it forever. In the decades that followed, the Hinterkaifeck Murders became a topic of fascination for crime enthusiasts, historians, and thrill-seekers. The mysterious case, with its unresolved questions and chilling details, captivated the imagination of people far beyond the borders of Bavaria. Books were written about the murders, and documentaries were made, yet none could provide the answers that had eluded the investigators all those years ago. Theories continued to circulate, with some believing that the killer had never left the farm, while others speculated about dark family secrets and hidden motives. The mystery remained tantalizingly out of reach, like a puzzle that refused to be solved. For those who had lived through the tragedy, though it was not just a mystery to be analyzed. It was a scar, a wound that never truly healed. The memory of the Smith family, the terror of the murders, and the strange aftermath lingered long after the farm was gone. The community of Kaifeck had been forever marked by the events of March 31st, 1922. In the years following World War II, the world changed dramatically. New wars, new crises, and new challenges emerged, but the haunting legacy of Hinterkaifeck endured. The farmstead was no longer there, but its presence, its chilling history, remained in the hearts and minds of those who knew the tale. The people of Kaifeck had learned to live with the haunting, but they could never forget the terror that had once unfolded on the land. It was a story of a family lost to the darkness, and of a mystery that would never be solved. The Hinterkaifeck Murders, though buried in the past, continued to cast a long shadow. And though the world moved on, the farm's legacy lived on in the whispers of those who remembered. In the quiet corners of modern Germany, the chilling case of the Hinterkaifeck Murders, which had long been buried beneath layers of time and tragedy, was suddenly brought back into the spotlight. Advances in forensic technology, the likes of which would have seemed unimaginable in the early 1920s, provided new hope for those who still clung to the idea that the mystery might someday be solved. The gruesome murders had haunted the people of Kaifeck for decades, and now, in the 21st century, the quest for answers seemed more plausible than ever. It all started when a group of police academy students, inspired by the cold case and eager to delve into the complexities of criminal investigations, decided to conduct a study on the Hinterkaifeck Murders. They had access to newly advanced forensic tools, including DNA analysis, fingerprinting, and cutting-edge techniques in digital reconstruction, tools that were far beyond anything available in 1922. Armed with these modern marvels of science, they set out to revisit the haunting crime scene, determined to uncover new leads and, hopefully, shed light on the identity of the killer. The students, led by their professor, Dr. Helmut Richter, gathered all available data: autopsy reports, witness statements, photographs of the crime scene, and details from the original investigation. They pored over the case with a meticulousness that only those who had grown up in the shadow of such an unsolved mystery could possess. For the first time in decades, there was hope that the case might finally yield some answers. "This is it," Dr. Richter said, pacing around the cramped seminar room as he reviewed the documents. "We have the technology to re-examine this case, to look at it in ways the original investigators could only dream of. If there's one thing we can do, it's test our hypotheses with modern science. There's a chance, just a chance, that we could find something they missed." One of the students, Eva, leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "But, Professor, we're still dealing with a crime that happened over a century ago. Even if we find new evidence, we won't have any surviving witnesses. It's just so old." Dr. Richter nodded solemnly. "You're right, Eva. The passage of time works against us in many ways. But sometimes, time can also reveal things that were hidden. And we owe it to those who perished at Hinterkaifeck to try." The group of students began their investigation by revisiting the evidence from the crime scene, piecing together the limited forensic details available. With DNA analysis, they were able to extract traces from the remains, carefully analyzing bloodstains and remnants that had been left behind in the aftermath of the brutal slayings. They even used advanced digital techniques to reconstruct the murder scene, an effort to better understand the flow of events on that fateful night. What we have now that they didn't have in 1922 is the ability to see things in a new light, said Marcus, another student. We can trace the movements of the killer, possibly even figure out if there was more than one person involved. Despite the promising advances, however, the investigation ran into a brick wall when it came to uncovering the identity of the killer. There were no clear suspects, and the evidence, while valuable, didn't lead directly to any one person. The students unearthed a wealth of new data, but the fact remained: the case was still shrouded in mystery. As the investigation continued, one breakthrough, however, caused a stir among the students. Through careful analysis of the crime scene and witness statements from those who had lived nearby, they identified a potential suspect, someone whose name had been previously overlooked. Their research led them to a man who had lived in the area at the time, a figure with a suspicious history of violent behavior, whose whereabouts at the time of the murders had always been unclear. According to some of the original witness accounts, this man was rumored to have been seen near Hinterkaifeck around the time of the murders, though no one had ever been able to confirm his involvement. But here, too, the mystery deepened. According to German privacy laws, the name of the suspect could not be revealed. The law protected the privacy of individuals, even those long dead, if their involvement in a crime was not definitively proven. So, the students found themselves stuck at a crossroads. They had a potential suspect, but without the ability to publicly name them, the case remained officially unsolved. Eva, frustrated, let out a sigh. So we've found someone, but we can't say who they are? How are we supposed to make any real progress if we're silenced like this? Dr. Richter, ever the optimist, reassured her. It's not perfect, but remember, this is a step forward. Even though we can't reveal everything, we've been able to apply modern methods to uncover things no one before could. And who knows? With time, as more evidence surfaces, perhaps more answers will emerge. The students continued their work, determined to bring the cold case to a close, but they knew the road ahead was long. Even with all the tools and resources at their disposal, the passage of time, the loss of witnesses, and the lack of a final piece of the puzzle made it nearly impossible to reach a conclusion. Still, they didn't give up. They knew that with every new discovery, they were bringing a piece of the truth to the surface, no matter how slowly. As they pored over the case details, one thing became clear. While modern forensics had undoubtedly shed new light on the case, the core of the mystery remained unsolved. The killer had carefully hidden their tracks, and the passage of time had only served to erase crucial details that could have provided the missing link to identifying them. Marcus sat back in his chair, rubbing his temples. We have all these new methods, but without any definitive evidence, it's like trying to read a book with pages missing. Dr. Richter, who had remained focused throughout, finally spoke, his voice heavy with resignation. This case was always going to be difficult. But now, with all the knowledge we have, we can at least say we've done everything we can. We may never know who killed the Smith family, but perhaps knowing we gave it our all will be enough. The investigation into the Hinterkaifeck murders may have reached another dead end, but the case still remains one of the most perplexing and fascinating mysteries in criminal history. Despite all the advances in technology, the truth remains elusive, buried deep in the past, waiting to be uncovered, perhaps someday, when the final pieces fall into place. For now, though, the name of the killer remains a well-guarded secret, locked away by both time and the law. The Hinterkaifeck murders, like the ghosts of the Smith family, linger, a testament to the darkness that can still haunt the present, even when the past seems long gone. The story of the Hinterkaifeck murders, though nearly a century old, continues to stir the imaginations of people around the world. Its chilling mystery has evolved into a legend, with every twist and turn fueling countless theories, books, documentaries, and films that seek to answer the one question that has eluded investigators for decades. Who killed the Smith family and why? In cafes and living rooms, around campfires, and in quiet corners of the internet, the name Hinterkaifeck still evokes hushed conversations. True crime enthusiasts and amateur sleuths pore over every detail, revisiting the crime scene, reanalyzing the evidence, and proposing new suspects. There's no shortage of theories, each more bizarre or convincing than the last. Could it have been a disgruntled family member or someone from the nearby village? Could the murderer have been a stranger, someone hiding in the shadows? Theories about the motive, be it money, revenge, or something far more sinister, are as varied as the people who try to explain the inexplicable. "I still don't understand it," whispered Matthias, a local historian, as he flipped through a well-worn book about the case. "It doesn't make sense. Why wouldn't the killer take the money? Why would they stay at the farm after the murders?" His friend, Greta, nodded, her face lined with curiosity. "I've always thought it was someone who knew the family. The way the killer stayed and fed the animals. They had to have been familiar with the farm. But still, nothing about this case adds up." Theories abounded in the small Bavarian village, where the memory of the grisly murders still lingered. Some believed the killer was someone from the village, someone who had been watching the Smith family for months, waiting for the perfect moment. Others pointed to the Smiths' dark family secrets, whispers of incest, of hidden motives and unresolved tensions. Could these family dynamics have driven someone to murder? Or was the killer simply a stranger who stumbled onto a vulnerable, isolated family? Could it be Carl Gabriel? Greta asked, almost as if testing the air. He was Victoria's husband, right? But was he really dead? Wasn't there talk that he may have faked his death during the war? Matthias shook his head. "No, that's just a rumor. The records confirm he died in the war. Still, some think he may have had a secret return, maybe even to claim his son, Joseph. But again, there's no concrete evidence." Theories like this only fueled the ongoing fascination with the murders. Some even suggested supernatural involvement. The strange noises coming from the attic, the footsteps leading into the house, but never leaving. These eerie details sparked imaginations, leading some to believe that there was something more than human hands involved in the killings. Could a ghost, a restless spirit, have been responsible for the deaths? Some even suggested that the farm itself was cursed, holding a dark force that led to the deaths of the family and their maid. Books began to surface, delving deep into the unsolved mystery. One author, Klaus Fischer, wrote an entire volume based on his own research, weaving together a story of betrayal, madness, and family tragedy. He theorized that Andrew Smith, the patriarch, had been harboring a dark secret, one that led to his violent end. But even Fisher admitted, "I can't tell you who did it. I can only tell you what I think happened." Films, too, have been made about Hinterkaifeck, some historical dramas, others leaning into the supernatural elements, dramatizing the unexplained noises and the grisly aftermath. Yet, all of them leave viewers with one haunting question: what truly happened behind the walls of the Smith family's home? And so, the legend of Hinterkaifeck continues to grow. People still drive out to the site, though all that remains are the bones of the land and the whispers in the wind. They stand in the clearing where the farmhouse once stood, where the murders took place, and feel the weight of history pressing down on them. Yet, even with all the theories and speculations, the truth about what happened on that March night in 1922 remains as elusive as the killer who walked away. The lack of concrete evidence, the absence of surviving witnesses, and the passage of time have all conspired to keep the mystery locked away. The police may have done their best with the tools they had, but the case, like so many others, slipped into the realm of unsolved crime, its resolution buried under years of silence and shadow. Still, the story of Hinterkaifeck remains a chilling chapter in true crime lore. It's a reminder of a brutal crime that took place in an era of upheaval and uncertainty, when families were torn apart not just by the events of war, but by the darkness that lurked in the quiet corners of rural life. As Germany reconciled its troubled past, the haunting mystery of Hinterkaifeck stood as a reminder of how even the smallest, most remote corners of a nation can harbor secrets too terrifying to comprehend. And perhaps, in the end, that is what keeps the story alive. The unanswered questions, the unsolved mystery, the ever-present shadows of the past. They haunt not only the village of Kaifeck, but the hearts of all who dare to ask, what happened on that night in 1922? Who killed the Smith family? And why? The legacy of Hinterkaifeck endures, a chilling reminder that some stories, no matter how much time passes, never quite fade away.